Marcus Thompson froze in the doorway of the Fairmont Grand Ballroom in San Francisco, his champagne glass tilting dangerously in his hand. The room was everything he'd spent 5 years climbing toward. Crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble, venture capitalists in Tom Ford suits, tech moguls whose names carried weight in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. This was his moment. The fundraiser where he'd finally network his way into the investor circles that mattered. But Marcus wasn't looking at the investors. He was staring at her. Elena Brooks stood 30 feet away in a navy dress that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Simple, elegant, confident. Her hair was pulled back the way she used to wear it when they were married. Practical, understated, but everything else about her had changed. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't small. She didn't look like she needed anything from anyone. And standing beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, was Joon Ha Park. The Joon Ha Park, Korean billionaire, tech philanthropist. The man Marcus had been desperately trying to impress for the last 18 months. Marcus's throat went dry. This wasn't possible. This was Elena, the woman he'd thrown out of their Chicago brownstone during a snowstorm 6 months ago. The woman he'd told, with absolute certainty, that no man would ever want. The woman whose small dreams he'd mocked every time she suggested volunteering, teaching, or doing anything that didn't advance his career. She was supposed to be broken, lost, regretting every decision that led her away from him. Instead, she looked like she'd never been more sure of where she belonged. Joon Ha leaned down and whispered something to her. Elena smiled, not the nervous, people-pleasing smile Marcus remembered, but something warmer, easier, real. Then her eyes lifted and met his across the room. For one brutal second, Marcus saw himself through her gaze. Not the successful corporate strategist he told himself he'd become. Not the man who'd outgrown her. But the hollow, insecure version of himself he'd been running from since the day he made his first 6 figures. Elena didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She simply acknowledged him the way you might acknowledge a stranger in an elevator, polite, distant, and already moving on. Marcus had spent months convincing himself that leaving Elena was the smartest decision he'd ever made. That she'd been holding him back. That cutting her loose meant cutting loose dead weight. But as he watched her turn back to Joon Ha, laughing at something only the two of them understood, Marcus realized something that made his chest tighten and his hands go cold. He hadn't left her behind. She'd left him in the dust. And the story of how that happened, how a woman discarded like trash became the woman a billionaire chose to stand beside, started long before that snowstorm night. It started in a Chicago townhouse, where Elena Brooks had learned to make herself so small, she almost disappeared entirely. Elena Brooks woke up at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm, the way she did every morning. She lay still for a moment, listening to Marcus breathe beside her, deep, unbothered, the sleep of a man who didn't question whether he belonged in the bed he occupied. Then she slipped out quietly, careful not to disturb the covers, and padded barefoot into the kitchen of their Lincoln Park brownstone. The coffee maker was already programmed. She'd set it the night before, along with Marcus's travel mug on the counter, his protein powder measured out beside it, and his dry cleaning receipt tucked into the side pocket of his briefcase. By 6:15, she had his breakfast plated, egg whites, turkey sausage, avocado toast on the sourdough he preferred from that bakery in Wicker Park. By 6:30, she'd ironed his shirt, the one he'd need for his meeting with the executive team at Sterling and Cross, the consulting firm where he'd recently made senior strategist. Marcus came downstairs at 6:42, already on his phone. "Morning," Elena said, sliding his plate across the island. He nodded without looking up, thumbs moving across the screen. She poured his coffee, black, no sugar, exactly 160 degrees because anything hotter, and he'd complain it burned his tongue. They used to have breakfast together. Back when Marcus was still climbing, still hungry, still convinced that Elena's support meant something. Back when he'd kiss her forehead and say, "I couldn't do this without you." That was 3 years ago. Now, Marcus ate in silence, scrolling through emails, occasionally frowning at something on the screen. Elena sat across from him with her own coffee, watching the morning light filter through the windows of the home she'd helped him buy. She'd given up her job for this. She'd been an elementary school teacher in Naperville, decent pay, good benefits, work that felt meaningful. But when Marcus got the offer at Sterling and Cross, He'd asked her to move to Chicago. Just until I get established, he'd said. Then you can find something here. Except once they moved, Marcus's hours became impossible. 12-hour days. Weekend client calls. Networking events that required a wife who looked good in cocktail dresses and knew when to smile and when to stay quiet. You're so good at this, Marcus would say, his hand on her lower back as they worked a room full of his colleagues. You make me look like I have my shit together. Elena had told herself it was temporary, that she'd go back to teaching once Marcus settled in. But then Marcus got promoted, and promoted again. And somewhere along the way, the question of what Elena wanted stopped coming up entirely. Did you call the cleaners? Marcus asked, still not looking at her. Yesterday. They're coming Thursday. And the guy about the furnace? Scheduled for next week. Good. Marcus stood, grabbing his briefcase. He paused at the door, glancing back like he'd forgotten something. For a second, Elena thought he might say thank you, or ask how she'd slept, or mention that it was their 5th wedding anniversary next month. Instead, he said, Can you pick up my suit from Rothman's? I need it for the investors' dinner Friday. Of course. Marcus left without saying goodbye. Elena sat at the island for a long time after the door closed, staring at his half-finished plate. She'd stopped eating breakfast with him months ago, not because he'd asked her to, but because sitting across from someone who didn't see you felt worse than sitting alone. She washed the dishes, wiped down the counters, started a load of laundry. By 9 a.m., the house was spotless, and Elena had run out of tasks to justify her existence. She opened her laptop and stared at the job search tabs she'd been keeping open for weeks. Teaching positions in Chicago, administrative roles, nonprofit coordinator gigs, anything that might give her a reason to leave the house that wasn't about making Marcus's life easier. But every time she got close to applying, she'd hear Marcus's voice in her head. You really want to go back to making $50,000 when I'm pulling in 6 figures? Seems like a step backward, babe. He'd said it casually, the way you might point out that it's raining. Not cruel, just factual. And Elena, who'd spent her entire adult life trying to be reasonable, had nodded and closed the laptop. That night, Marcus came home after 10 p.m., smelling like expensive whiskey and someone else's perfume. Elena was already in bed, pretending to read. Good day, she asked. Long, Marcus said, loosening his tie. Peterson's being a dick about the merger. Might have to fly to New York next week. Okay. Marcus disappeared into the bathroom. Elena heard the shower start, and she wondered, not for the first time, if she was supposed to ask about the perfume. If a stronger woman would have demanded answers by now. But Elena had become very good at not asking questions she didn't want answered. When Marcus finally came to bed, he didn't kiss her goodnight, didn't touch her, just rolled onto his side and closed his eyes, already halfway to sleep. Elena lay in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing, and realized something that made her chest ache. She couldn't remember the last time Marcus had looked at her like she mattered. Not like she was useful, not like she was convenient, but like she mattered. And the worst part, the part that made her hate herself a little, was that she'd spent so long trying to be what Marcus needed, she'd forgotten what it felt like to need anything for herself. The first time Elena saw Marcus with another woman, she convinced herself it was a misunderstanding. It was a Tuesday in late September, and she'd driven to the Loop to drop off Marcus's forgotten portfolio, the one he needed for his presentation at Sterling and Cross. She'd called twice, but he hadn't answered, so she decided to just bring it herself. Be helpful. Be the wife who solved problems before they became problems. She found him outside a cafe on West Randolph, laughing with a woman in a pencil skirt and heels sharp enough to puncture concrete. The woman's hand was on Marcus's arm, her head tilted back in that performative way people laugh when they're flirting. Marcus saw Elena approaching and his expression shifted, not guilty, exactly, but annoyed, like she'd interrupted something. Babe, he said, his voice tight. What are you doing here? Elena held up the portfolio. You forgot this, right? Marcus took it without thanking her, then turned to the woman. This is my wife, Elena. Elena, this is Simone. She's with Peterson's team. Simone smiled like she'd just won something. Oh, Marcus talks about you all the time. Elena doubted that. I should go, Simone said, squeezing Marcus's arm one more time. See you at the meeting? Absolutely. Simone walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown. Marcus turned to Elena, his jaw tight. You didn't need to come all the way down here. You needed the portfolio. I would have figured it out. Elena blinked. I was trying to help. By embarrassing me in front of a colleague. I didn't. You made it seem like I can't keep my shit together, Elena. Like I need my wife to babysit me. Marcus shook his head, already stepping back toward the office. Next time, just let me handle it. He left her standing there on the sidewalk, holding the memory of his irritation like a stone in her chest. That night, Marcus didn't come home until after midnight. The second time, Elena didn't see it. She smelled it. Marcus had started coming home later and later, always with an excuse: client dinners, networking events, last-minute strategy sessions that somehow always required drinks afterward. Elena stopped asking where he'd been, stopped checking his phone, stopped doing the things wives in bad movies did when they suspected their husbands of cheating, because acknowledging it meant dealing with it. And dealing with it meant admitting that the marriage she'd sacrificed everything for was already over. But one Friday night in October, Marcus came home reeking of perfume so thick it clung to his shirt like a confession. Elena was in the living room, folding laundry. Marcus walked past her without a word, heading straight for the stairs. Marcus! He stopped, one hand on the banister. What? Elena's voice was calm. Too calm. Where were you tonight? Networking event. I told you this morning. You smell like perfume. Marcus turned, and for the first time in months, he looked directly at her. His expression wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was bored. It was a crowded event, Elena. People wear perfume. He said it like he was explaining something to a child. You want me to shower before I talk to women now? That's not what I... Because if you're going to start acting jealous and insecure every time I come home late, we're going to have a problem. Elena's hands stilled on the towel she'd been folding. I'm not being jealous. Then what is this? Marcus gestured at her, his voice rising. You think I'm out here cheating on you? You think I have time for that? I didn't say that. But you're implying it. Marcus laughed, sharp, humorless. You know what? Maybe if you had something going on in your own life, you wouldn't spend so much time worrying about mine. Elena felt the words land like a slap. I gave up my career for you, she said quietly. No one asked you to do that. You did. You said. I said it would be temporary. Marcus's voice was cold now, controlled. That was 5 years ago, Elena. At some point, you have to stop blaming me for choices you made. He went upstairs, leaving Elena alone with the laundry and the smell of someone else's perfume still hanging in the air. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying months ago. Instead, she folded the rest of the laundry in silence. Each precise crease a small act of control in a life that had long since stopped feeling like hers. By November, Marcus wasn't even pretending anymore. He'd come home late, sometimes not at all, offering explanations that grew thinner and less convincing with each passing week. Stayed at Peterson's place. Crashed at the office. You were already asleep, didn't want to wake you. Elena stopped asking, and Marcus stopped pretending to care that she'd noticed. One Sunday morning, Elena was making coffee when Marcus came downstairs, already dressed for the gym. I'm meeting clients for brunch after, he said, grabbing his keys. Don't wait up. Elena turned. It's Sunday. So, we haven't spent a Sunday together in 2 months. Marcus sighed like she'd just asked him to explain quantum physics. Elena, I'm in the middle of the biggest deal of my career. I don't have time for... He stopped himself, but the rest of the sentence hung there anyway. I don't have time for you. For what? Elena asked, her voice quiet but steady. Say it. Marcus met her eyes, and for a moment, Elena saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, not regret, but something worse. Contempt. You really want to do this right now? Marcus asked. I want you to finish your sentence. Marcus set his keys down on the counter, slowly, deliberately. When he spoke, his voice was calm. Too calm. Fine. You want honesty? I don't have time to pretend that sitting around this house all day watching HGTV and folding my laundry is a real life. I don't have time to make you feel better about the fact that you gave up on your own ambitions and now you resent me for actually having some. Elena's chest tightened. That's not fair, isn't it? Marcus stepped closer. You act like you sacrificed so much for me. But what exactly did you sacrifice, Elena? A $50,000 teaching job? Mediocre benefits? Summers off. I sacrificed us. I gave up everything so you could build your career, and now I'm successful, Marcus interrupted. And instead of being proud of me, you're bitter. Instead of finding your own purpose, you sit here waiting for me to come home and validate your existence. Elena's voice cracked. I supported you. No, Marcus said coldly. You made yourself small and comfortable and then blamed me when I outgrew you. The words hit like a hammer. Marcus grabbed his keys and walked out, leaving Elena standing in the kitchen of a house that suddenly felt too big and too empty and too much like a cage she'd built herself. She didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at the coffee she'd made for a man who'd stopped seeing her as anything more than furniture. And for the first time, Elena let herself think the thought she'd been avoiding for months. He's right. Not about her being small, not about giving up, but about one thing. She had stopped fighting for her own life. She'd let Marcus become her entire world. And now that world was crumbling, and she had no idea who she was supposed to be without him. The night Marcus threw her out started like any other. Elena was in the kitchen, cleaning up after a dinner Marcus hadn't come home for. It was mid-December, and Chicago was in the grip of a brutal cold snap, the kind that made your lungs ache when you breathed too deeply, the kind that turned Lake Michigan into a frozen sheet of glass. She heard the door open just after 11 p.m. Marcus walked in, and Elena knew immediately that something had shifted. He wasn't just distant. He wasn't just cold. He was done. We need to talk, Marcus said, not bothering to take off his coat. Elena dried her hands on a towel. Okay. Marcus stood in the doorway of the kitchen, hands in his pockets, and for a long moment he just looked at her, not with anger, not with regret, but with the kind of detached assessment you'd give a piece of furniture you were deciding whether to keep or donate. This isn't working, he said finally. Elena's stomach dropped. What isn't working? Us. This. Marcus gestured vaguely at the space between them. You. Me. All of it. Marcus. I've been thinking about this for a while, he continued, his voice steady, almost clinical. And I think it's time we admit that we're not who we used to be. I've changed. You've stayed the same. And I don't think there's a version of this where we both end up happy. Elena felt her chest tighten. So what are you saying? I'm saying I want you out. The words landed like a punch. Out. Elena repeated. Of the house. Of my life. Marcus's expression didn't change. I've already talked to a lawyer. The house is in my name. I bought it before we got married, so you don't have a claim. I'll give you 2 weeks to. 2 weeks. Elena's voice cracked. Marcus, it's December. It's the middle of winter. Then I suggest you start packing. Elena stared at him, searching his face for any trace of the man she'd married. The man who'd held her hand during her father's funeral. The man who'd promised, in front of their families, that he'd love her in sickness and health, for richer or poorer. But that man was gone. Why now? Elena asked quietly. Marcus shrugged. Because I'm tired of pretending. Pretending what? That you're anything more than dead weight. Marcus's voice was flat, matter of fact. You don't work. You don't contribute. You just exist. And I don't need you anymore, Elena. I haven't needed you for a long time. Elena's hands were shaking. I gave up everything for you. No one asked you to. You did. You asked me to move here. You asked me to quit my job. You asked me to. I asked you to support me while I built something. Marcus interrupted. And you did. Congratulations. But that doesn't mean you get to coast on my success forever. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. I'm your wife. Not for long. Marcus pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the counter. Divorce papers. Sign them and leave them with my lawyer. Elena looked at the envelope like it was something toxic. I need more than 2 weeks, she said. You're leaving tonight. Elena's head snapped up. What? Tonight? Marcus repeated. I've already packed your things. They're by the door. Elena felt the ground tilt beneath her. Marcus, it's midnight. It's snowing. I don't have anywhere to go. That's not my problem. You can't just. I can, Marcus said coldly. And I am. He walked to the front door and opened it. Snow rushed in, carried by a wind so sharp it felt like knives. Elena could see her suitcase sitting just outside the threshold, already dusted with white. Marcus, please. You're leaving tonight, Marcus said calmly, holding the door open. You can walk out, or I can call the police and have you removed. Your choice. Elena stood frozen, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. After everything I gave you? Her voice cracked, and she hated how small she sounded. Marcus shook his head, and for the first time that night, he smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, cruelly. You didn't give me anything worth keeping, he said. And don't worry, Elena. No man is going to want you anyway. The words hit her like a physical blow. Elena stood there, trembling, staring at the man she'd loved, the man she'd sacrificed for, the man who was now watching her with the kind of cold satisfaction people reserve for taking out the trash. She wanted to scream, to beg, to make him see her, really see her, one last time. But something inside her went very still. Elena walked to the door, her legs shaking, her hands numb. She picked up the suitcase. It was heavier than she expected. Marcus had thrown her things in without care, without thought, the way you'd pack for a trip you didn't care about. She stepped into the snow, and the cold hit her like a wall. Behind her, she heard the door close. Not slammed, just closed. Final. Elena stood on the sidewalk, breath shaking, snow soaking through her coat, and looked back at the brownstone she'd cleaned and decorated and turned into a home. The lights inside were still on. She could see Marcus's silhouette moving past the window, already back to his life, already forgetting she existed. Elena didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't collapse. She simply picked up her suitcase and started walking. The streets of Lincoln Park were empty, the snow falling in thick, silent sheets. Elena walked without direction, without a plan, her mind blank except for one thought that looped over and over. He was supposed to love me. Somewhere around 2 a.m., Elena found herself outside a 24-hour diner near Belmont. She went inside, shaking, soaked through, and ordered coffee she couldn't taste. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked at her with something close to recognition. "You okay, honey?" Elena opened her mouth to say yes. Instead, she started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, exhausted tears that had been building for years. The waitress didn't ask questions. She just brought more coffee and a blanket from the back and let Elena sit there until dawn broke over the city that no longer felt like home. When the sun finally came up, Elena pulled out her phone and searched for one word. Shelter. The women's shelter on West Armitage smelled like disinfectant and instant coffee and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having nowhere else to go. Elena arrived on a Wednesday morning, her suitcase still damp from the snow, her eyes red but dry. The intake coordinator, a woman named Sharon with graying locks and the no-nonsense warmth of someone who'd seen everything, handed her a clipboard and a pen. "You have family in Chicago?" Sharon asked. Elena shook her head. "Friends? Not anymore." Sharon nodded, like she'd heard that before. "You're safe here. That's what matters." Elena was assigned a bed in a room with 5 other women. The walls were painted beige. The mattress was thin. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly. It was the first place in years where Elena didn't feel like she was performing. She stayed at the shelter for 3 weeks. During the day, she helped in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, learning the rhythms of communal survival. At night, she lay awake listening to the other women breathe and thought about how far she'd fallen. Except it didn't feel like falling. It felt like landing. One of the women in her room, a single mother named Tasha who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford rent, asked Elena what she used to do. "I was a teacher," Elena said. Tasha's eyes lit up. "My daughter needs help with reading. Any chance you could tutor her?" Elena hesitated. She hadn't taught in 5 years. Hadn't thought about lesson plans or phonics or the way a child's face lights up when a word finally clicks. But she said yes anyway. That afternoon, Elena sat with Tasha's daughter, a quiet 8-year-old named Maya who was 2 grades behind in reading, and opened a battered copy of Charlotte's Web. Maya struggled through the first paragraph, stumbling over words like salutations and extraordinary. But by the end of the chapter, something had shifted. Maya looked up at Elena with wide eyes and said, "Can we read more tomorrow?" Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. "Absolutely." Word spread quickly. Within days, Elena was tutoring 3 kids at the shelter. Then 5. Then 8. Sharon pulled her aside one morning. "You're good at this." "It's just reading," Elena said. "It's not just anything." Sharon handed her a flyer. "There's a literacy nonprofit in Seattle looking for volunteers. They work with immigrant families. It's paid work. Not much, but enough to get you started." Elena stared at the flyer. Seattle was 2,000 miles away. A city she'd never been to. A life she'd have to build from scratch. "Why Seattle?" Elena asked. Sharon smiled. "Because it's not Chicago." 3 weeks later, Elena boarded a one-way flight to Seattle-Tacoma with everything she owned in a single suitcase. She didn't cry when the plane took off. She didn't look back at the city where she'd lost herself. She just watched Chicago disappear beneath the clouds and thought, this is where I start again. Seattle was gray and wet, and nothing like Elena expected. She found a studio apartment in Greenwood, tiny, affordable, with a view of a coffee shop and a bus stop. She furnished it with secondhand furniture from Goodwill and a single houseplant she was determined not to kill. And then she went to work. The nonprofit was called Voices and Pages, and it operated out of a converted warehouse in the International District. The director, a Vietnamese woman named Linh Nguyen who'd started the organization after immigrating to the U.S. at age 12, hired Elena on the spot. You have teaching experience? Linh asked. 5 years. Elementary school. Good. We need someone who understands that learning to read isn't just about letters. It's about access, opportunity, dignity. Elena felt something stir in her chest, something that had been dormant for years. Purpose. She started the next Monday. The kids at Voices and Pages were different from the students Elena had taught in Naperville. Many were refugees or children of immigrants, navigating a country whose language they were still learning. Some were quiet and cautious. Others were loud and defiant, testing boundaries because boundaries had failed them before. Elena treated them all the same, with patience, consistency, and the kind of quiet respect that said, I see you. I believe you can do this. One of her students, a 10-year-old Somali boy named Abdi who'd arrived in Seattle 6 months earlier, barely spoke during his first 2 weeks in her class. He'd sit in the corner, arms crossed, staring at the books like they were written in code. Elena didn't push. She just showed up every day, read aloud, and waited. On the 3rd week, Abdi finally spoke. My mom doesn't know how to read English, he said quietly. Elena set down her book. Does she want to learn? Abdi nodded. Then bring her next week. We'll teach her too. Abdi's mother, a woman named Sarah who'd survived civil war in a refugee camp and the particular cruelty of starting over in a country that didn't speak her language, showed up the following Monday. Elena spent the next 3 months teaching them together. Slowly, patiently, one word at a time. And somewhere in that process, Elena realized something. She wasn't just teaching them how to read. She was remembering how to be whole. By the time spring arrived, Elena had been in Seattle for 4 months. She had a routine now: wake up at 6 a.m., walk to the coffee shop on Greenwood, take the bus to the International District, teach until 4 p.m., come home and make dinner in her tiny kitchen. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't lucrative, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, Elena didn't feel like she was taking up too little space. She felt like she was building something. One afternoon in late April, Linh called Elena into her office. We have a donor visiting next week, Linh said. Big donor. He's funding a new literacy program for immigrant youth. I'd like you to sit in on the meeting. Me? Elena asked. Why? Linh smiled. Because he wants to hear from the people actually doing the work. Elena nodded, nervous but steady. She didn't know it yet, but that meeting would change everything. Because the donor Linh was talking about wasn't just another wealthy philanthropist writing checks to ease his conscience. His name was Joon Ha Park, and he'd been watching Elena for months. Joon Ha Park arrived at Voices and Pages on a Tuesday morning in early May, flanked by 2 assistants and dressed in the kind of understated elegance that only comes from having nothing left to prove. Elena had Googled him the night before, mostly out of curiosity, partly out of nerves. Korean American, self-made billionaire, built a tech company from his garage in Redmond and sold it to Google for $2.3 billion when he was 32. Now 40, unmarried, and according to Forbes, one of the most influential philanthropists in the Pacific Northwest. The articles painted him as brilliant, disciplined, and intensely private. There were no tabloid stories, no scandals, just a man who'd grown up poor in Tacoma, worked his way through the University of Washington, and now spent his fortune funding education programs for low-income communities. When he walked into the Voices and Pages office, Elena's first thought was, he doesn't look like a billionaire. Joon Ha wore dark jeans, a gray sweater, and no jewelry except a simple watch. His hair was neat but not styled. His expression was calm, attentive, the look of someone who listened more than he spoke. Linh introduced him to the team, and Joon Ha shook hands with everyone. Not the perfunctory grip of someone going through the motions, but the kind of handshake that said, I'm actually paying attention. When he got to Elena, he paused. Elena Brooks, Linh said. One of our best literacy instructors. She's been with us since January. Joon Ha extended his hand. Nice to meet you. You too, Elena said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Joon Ha's grip was firm but not aggressive. His eyes met hers, not in the way Marcus used to, assessing her value or her usefulness, but with something quieter. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. Lin tells me you work with immigrant families, Joon Ha said. I do. Mostly kids, but some parents too. That's not easy work. No, Elena agreed. But it's worth it. Joon Ha nodded, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, something that looked like respect. Then he moved on to the next person, and Elena exhaled slowly, feeling oddly seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Lin presented the new literacy program, how it would work, who it would serve, what the funding would cover. Joon Ha asked questions, but not the surface-level kind. He wanted to know about retention rates, student outcomes, family engagement. He wanted specifics, not platitudes. When Lin asked if any of the instructors wanted to speak, Elena hesitated. Then she raised her hand. I work with a family, a mother and son from Somalia, Elena said, her voice steady. When they started, neither of them could read a children's book. Now the son reads at grade level, and the mom just passed her citizenship test. Joon Ha leaned forward slightly. How long did that take? For months. But it's not just about time. It's about trust. They didn't believe they could learn until someone showed them they already had everything they needed. Joon Ha held her gaze for a long moment. That's the work, he said quietly. After the meeting, Joon Ha stayed to observe a class. He sat in the back of Elena's classroom, silent and still, while she worked with a group of 5 kids, ages 8 to 12, on a reading exercise. The kids were loud, chaotic, full of energy. One of them, a Syrian boy named Kareem, kept interrupting with questions that had nothing to do with the lesson. Marcus would have been annoyed. He would have seen the chaos as disorder, the interruptions as disrespect. But Elena leaned into it. She answered Kareem's questions, redirected gently, and kept the class moving forward without losing the thread of curiosity that had started the tangent in the first place. When the class ended, Joon Ha approached her. You're patient, he said. They're smart kids, Elena replied. They just need someone to meet them where they are. Joon Ha nodded. Not everyone understands that. Elena smiled faintly. I didn't always. Joon Ha studied her for a moment. Not the way Marcus used to, measuring her worth, but the way someone looks at a puzzle they're genuinely interested in solving. Can I ask you something? He said. Sure. Why Seattle? Elena hesitated. It wasn't a question she'd expected. I needed to start over, she said finally. Somewhere that didn't know me. Joon Ha didn't push. He just nodded, like that made perfect sense. Well, he said, I'm glad you ended up here. Then he left, and Elena stood there for a long time, replaying the conversation and wondering why it had felt different from every other interaction she'd had in the past year. Joon Ha didn't ask her out, didn't flirt, didn't make her feel like she owed him anything. He just saw her, and that, Elena realized, was rarer than she'd thought. Over the next few weeks, Joon Ha kept showing up. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that Elena started to notice. He'd sit in on classes, ask Lin about program outcomes, talk to the kids in a way that felt genuine, not performative. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he'd stop by Elena's classroom after she finished teaching. They'd talk about the kids, about the challenges of literacy education, about the way systems failed people before people failed themselves. Joon Ha never asked personal questions, never pried, never made Elena feel like she had to explain the gaps in her resume or the sadness that sometimes flickered across her face when she thought no one was looking. But he listened, and slowly, carefully, Elena started to trust him. One afternoon in late June, after a particularly chaotic class, Joon Ha lingered by the door while Elena cleaned up. You're good at this, he said. Elena laughed softly. You've said that before. I mean it. Joon Ha stepped into the room, hands in his pockets. Most people in education talk about serving the underserved, but you don't talk like that. You just do the work. Elena set down the stack of books she'd been organizing. Because it's not charity. It's just what's right. Joon Ha smiled. Not a big smile, not showy, just something quiet and real. Can I take you to coffee? He asked. Elena's heart did something complicated. Why? Because I'd like to know you better. It wasn't a line. It wasn't a move. It was just honest. Elena thought about Marcus. about the way he'd made her feel small, invisible, disposable. And then she thought about Joon Ha, about the way he looked at her like she was someone worth understanding. Okay, Elena said. Joon Ha's smile widened slightly. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. As Joon Ha left, Elena stood in the empty classroom and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The coffee shop Joon Ha chose was in Fremont, a small, unassuming place called Milstead and Company that served single-origin pour-overs and didn't have Wi-Fi. The kind of place where people actually talk to each other. Elena arrived 5 minutes early, her hands shaking slightly as she ordered a latte. She hadn't been on a date in over a decade. And even though Joon Ha had been careful not to call it that, Elena knew what this was. A beginning. Maybe. When Joon Ha walked in, he was wearing jeans and a dark blue Henley, his hair slightly damp like he'd just showered. He smiled when he saw her, easy, unguarded, and suddenly Elena's nerves settled. You found it, Joon Ha said, sitting across from her. Barely. I got turned around twice. Seattle's like that. Nothing's on a grid. They ordered coffee. Joon Ha got a Cordido, black, and for a while, they just talked about small things. The city, the weather, the way gentrification was pushing out the artists and immigrants who'd made neighborhoods like Fremont interesting in the first place. Joon Ha didn't dominate the conversation. He asked questions, listened, paused before responding in a way that made Elena feel like her words actually mattered. Can I ask you something? Joon Ha said after a while. Elena tensed slightly. Sure. Why teaching? Elena relaxed. That, at least, was easy. Because I'm good at it, she said. And because it's one of the few jobs where you can actually see the impact you're making. A kid who couldn't read in January is reading chapter books by June. That's tangible. Real. Joon Ha nodded. Not a lot of work feels that way. No, Elena agreed. What about you? Why education philanthropy? Joon Ha leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I grew up poor, he said simply. My parents immigrated from Korea when I was 3. My dad worked at a Boeing plant. My mom cleaned houses. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Tacoma, and I shared a mattress with my brother until I was 12. Elena stayed quiet, sensing there was more. The only reason I got out was education. Joon Ha continued. I had teachers who believed I could do more than survive, who taught me that being poor didn't mean I was less capable. And once I made money, the only thing that felt worth spending it on was making sure other kids had the same chance. Elena felt something tighten in her chest. That's rare. What is? People who remember where they came from. Joon Ha smiled faintly. It's hard to forget when you spent your childhood translating bills for your parents because they couldn't read English. They talked for 2 hours. Then 3. The coffee shop emptied out around them, and still they stayed. The conversation drifting from work to life to the strange alchemy of survival. Joon Ha didn't ask about her past, didn't pry into why she'd come to Seattle or what she was running from. But eventually, Elena told him anyway. I was married, she said quietly. For 5 years. I gave up my career to support his. And when he didn't need me anymore, he threw me out. Literally. In the middle of winter. Joon Ha's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. I'm sorry, he said. Elena shook her head. I'm not. Not anymore. It hurt, but it also freed me. I spent so long trying to be what he needed that I forgot I could just be myself. And now, Elena smiled. Now I'm figuring out who that is. Joon Ha didn't offer advice. Didn't try to fix her or rescue her or make her feel like she needed saving. He just said, I think you're doing a good job. And for some reason, that meant more than anything else he could have said. They started seeing each other regularly after that. Always in public, always casual. Coffee, lunch, a walk around Green Lake. Joon Ha never rushed, never pushed, never made Elena feel like she owed him anything. He'd text her in the mornings, hope you have a good day. He'd remember details she'd mentioned in passing, like the fact that she hated cilantro or that her favorite author was Toni Morrison. He'd ask about her students, her work, her life in a way that felt genuinely curious, not performative. And slowly, so slowly Elena almost didn't notice, she started to feel safe. One evening in late July, they were walking along the Burke-Gilman Trail, the sun low and golden over Lake Washington, when Joon Ha stopped suddenly. Can I tell you something? He asked. Elena's heart sped up. Okay. I've been thinking about you a lot, Joon Ha said. And I don't want to rush you or make you feel pressured. But I need you to know that I'm not interested in casual. I'm interested in you. And if you're not ready for that, I'll wait. But if you don't feel the same way, I need to know. Elena's breath caught. Marcus had never said anything like that. He'd assumed, demanded, expected her to fall in line. But Joon Ha was asking, giving her space to choose, giving her power in a situation where she'd spent so long having none. I'm scared, Elena said honestly. Of what? Of getting it wrong again. Of giving everything to someone who'll make me feel small. Joon Ha stepped closer, his voice steady. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise I'll never make you feel like you're not enough. Elena looked up at him, searching his face for doubt, for insincerity, for the crack that would reveal this was too good to be true. But all she saw was patience and certainty. Okay, Elena said quietly. Okay, I want to try. Joon Ha smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made Elena feel, for the first time in years, like she'd made the right choice. Good, he said, because I'm all in. Over the next few months, Elena learned what it felt like to be loved without conditions. Joon Ha didn't need her to be smaller so he could feel bigger. He didn't mock her work or dismiss her ambitions or make her feel like she had to shrink to fit into his life. Instead, he asked about her goals, her dreams, what she wanted to build. And when Elena admitted, one night over dinner, that she'd been thinking about starting her own literacy program, something independent, something hers, Joon Ha didn't laugh. He said, "What do you need to make that happen?" Elena blinked. What? Resources? Funding? Connections? What do you need? I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. Joon Ha leaned forward. Then let's figure it out together. Elena felt her throat tighten. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Joon Ha interrupted gently. But I want to. Not because you need saving, but because what you're building matters. And I want to be part of it, if you'll let me. Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by the sheer novelty of being seen not as a burden, but as a partner. Thank you, she whispered. Joon Ha reached across the table and took her hand. You don't have to thank me, Elena. You just have to keep being you. And for the first time in her life, Elena believed that being herself was enough. The invitation arrived in Elena's inbox on a Wednesday morning in early October. Global Tech and Philanthropy Summit, San Francisco, California, October 15th to 17th, 2026. Lynn forwarded it to her with a note. Joon Ha put your name on the guest list. You should go. Elena stared at the email for a long time. San Francisco, a city Marcus had always talked about wanting to live in someday. A city filled with the kind of people Marcus had spent his entire career trying to impress. She almost said no. But then Joon Ha called. You don't have to go, he said immediately. But I think you'd benefit from the connections. There are funders there who care about literacy programs. People who could help you build what you've been planning. Elena hesitated. Will you be there? I'll be there. Something in his voice, steady, grounding, made the decision easier. Okay, Elena said. I'll go. The summit was held at the Fairmont Grand Ballroom. All marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the particular kind of opulence that whispered you've made it. Elena wore a navy dress Joon Ha had insisted on buying for her. Simple, elegant, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup minimal. She looked like she belonged. And for the first time in her life, she felt like it too. Joon Ha met her in the lobby, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him, which, Elena realized, it probably had been. You look beautiful, he said. Elena smiled. You clean up pretty well yourself. Joon Ha offered his arm, and they walked into the ballroom together. The room was packed. Venture capitalists, tech CEOs, philanthropists, policymakers. The kind of people who moved markets and shaped industries and spent more on a single dinner than most families made in a year. Elena felt a flicker of nerves. And then Joon Ha leaned down and whispered, You belong here more than half these people. Don't forget that. Elena exhaled, nodded. They moved through the room together, Joon Ha introducing her to donors, program directors, foundation heads. Elena talked about voices and pages, about her plans for her own program, about the families she'd worked with and the impact literacy could have on generational poverty. People listened, took her card, asked follow-up questions. Elena realized, with something close to shock, that they were taking her seriously. And then, from across the room, she saw him. Marcus. He was standing near the bar, laughing too loudly, his hand on the shoulder of a man Elena didn't recognize. He wore an expensive suit. Too expensive, probably. and the kind of confidence that came from convincing yourself you'd earned something you hadn't. Elena's stomach dropped. Joon Ha noticed immediately. You okay? That's him, Elena said quietly. My ex-husband. Joon Ha followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. Do you want to leave? Elena thought about it. Thought about running. About avoiding confrontation the way she'd avoided it for years. And then she thought about everything she'd built since that night in the snow. No, Elena said. I want to stay. Joon Ha squeezed her hand gently. Then we stay. Marcus saw her 10 minutes later. He'd been mid-laugh, mid-gesture, when his eyes landed on Elena across the room. His expression froze, confusion flickering into recognition, recognition into disbelief. Elena watched him process it. Watched the moment he realized that the woman standing beside Joon Ha Park, the Joon Ha Park, was the same woman he'd thrown out into the snow. The same woman he'd told would never be wanted. Marcus's champagne glass tilted dangerously in his hand. Joon Ha leaned down. He's coming over. I know. Marcus approached slowly, his confidence faltering with every step. When he reached them, he looked at Elena like he was seeing a ghost. Elena, he said, his voice too loud, too forced. Wow. I didn't expect to see you here. Elena met his eyes, her voice calm. Hello, Marcus. Marcus's gaze flicked to Joon Ha, then back to Elena, his expression shifting into something uglier. You know him? We're together, Elena said simply. Marcus laughed, sharp, disbelieving. You, and, he gestured at Joon Ha. You expect me to believe that? Joon Ha's expression didn't change. I don't care what you believe. Marcus's jaw tightened. He turned back to Elena, and for a moment, something desperate flickered across his face. Elena, can we talk? Privately. No, Elena said. I just want to. I said no. Marcus's voice dropped, taking on the tone he used to use when he wanted to sound reasonable. Look, I know things ended badly. I know I said some things I shouldn't have, but I've been thinking about you. About us. And I think maybe we made a mistake. Elena stared at him, and suddenly she saw him clearly. Not as the man who destroyed her. Not as the villain in her story. Just as a small, insecure man who'd spent so long climbing that he'd forgotten why he was climbing at all. You didn't make a mistake, Elena said quietly. You showed me exactly who you were. And I'm grateful for that. Marcus's face flushed. Grateful? Yes. Because if you hadn't thrown me out, I never would have found the life I have now. You mean the life he gave you? Marcus jerked his head toward Joon Ha. Joon Ha's voice was cold. She built her life herself. I just had the privilege of being part of it. Marcus laughed bitterly. Right. So what? You're her charity case now. Is that how this works? Elena felt anger flare. Not at Marcus, but for herself. For the woman she used to be who would have let those words land. I'm not anyone's charity case, Elena said, her voice steady. I'm a literacy educator. I run a program that serves immigrant families. And I'm starting my own nonprofit next year. None of that has anything to do with Joon Ha's money. It has to do with the work I've been doing since the night you decided I wasn't worth keeping. Marcus stared at her, speechless. You told me no man would want me, Elena continued. And you were wrong. But the truth is, I don't need to be wanted to matter. I matter because I exist. Because I do work that changes lives. And whether you see that or not doesn't change the fact that it's true. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say. Joon Ha placed a hand on Elena's back. Gentle, supportive, not possessive. We should go, he said quietly. Elena nodded. As they turned to leave, Marcus called after them. Elena, wait. But Elena didn't look back. She just kept walking, her hand in Joon Ha's, her head high, toward the life she'd built from nothing. Behind her, Marcus stood alone in the middle of the ballroom, watching the woman he'd discarded walk away for the second time. Except this time, she wasn't broken. She was free. Marcus called 3 days later. Elena was in her Seattle apartment, grading worksheets from her students, when her phone buzzed. She saw his name on the screen and almost didn't answer. But curiosity, or maybe closure, made her pick up. Hello. Elena. Marcus's voice was different. Smaller. Thank you for answering. What do you want, Marcus? There was a pause. Elena could hear him breathing on the other end, gathering courage or composing a script. She couldn't tell which. I wanted to apologize, he said finally, for what I said at the gala, and for everything else. Elena set down her pen. Okay. That's it. Just okay. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Marcus exhaled shakily. I've been thinking a lot since I saw you. About how things ended. About what I said to you that night. Elena waited. I was cruel, Marcus continued. And I was wrong. You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve any of it. No, Elena agreed. I didn't. I was in a bad place. The pressure at work, the stress. Marcus. Yeah. I don't care why you did it. I only care that you did. Another pause. I miss you, Marcus said quietly. Elena almost laughed. You don't miss me. You miss having someone who made your life easier. That's not true, isn't it? Elena's voice was calm, not angry. You didn't miss me when you were cheating. You didn't miss me when you were mocking my work. You didn't miss me when you threw me out in the snow. You only miss me now because you saw me with someone you respect. Because my value went up in your eyes. Elena. But my value never changed, Marcus. Your perception of it did. And that's not my problem anymore. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice cracked. I made a mistake. You made a lot of mistakes. Can we at least talk? In person? Just once. Elena thought about it. Thought about the woman she used to be who would have said yes out of guilt or obligation or the desperate hope that Marcus might finally see her. But she wasn't that woman anymore. No, Elena said. I don't think that would be good for either of us. Please. I just want a chance to make things right. You can't make it right, Marcus. It's done. So that's it. You're just going to walk away. I already walked away, Elena said gently. 6 months ago. In the snow. You're the one who's still trying to hold on. Marcus made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. Elena couldn't tell. I'm sorry, he said again. I know you are. But that doesn't change anything. What do you want me to do? I want you to move on, Elena said. I want you to learn from this. I want you to treat the next person better than you treated me. But I don't want you to do it for me. I want you to do it because it's the right thing to do. And that's it. That's it. Marcus was silent for so long Elena thought he'd hung up. Then he said, very quietly, he's lucky. That guy you're with. Elena smiled faintly. I'm the lucky one. Yeah, Marcus said. I'm starting to see that. He hung up. Elena sat there for a moment, phone still in her hand, and felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Not sadness. Just peace. Marcus had been a chapter in her life. An important one, maybe. A painful one, certainly. But he wasn't the whole story. Elena picked up her pen and went back to grading papers. The sound of rain against the window a gentle reminder that some storms pass and leave clarity in their wake. That night, Joon Ha came over with takeout from their favorite Thai place in Wallingford. They ate on the floor of Elena's tiny living room, containers spread out between them, talking about nothing and everything. Marcus called today, Elena said after a while. Joon Ha paused mid-bite. Yeah. He wanted to apologize. Asked if we could meet up. What did you say? I said no. Joon Ha nodded slowly. How do you feel about that? Good, Elena said. Really good, actually. Joon Ha smiled. Good. Elena leaned against the couch, watching him. Can I ask you something? Always. Why me? Joon Ha looked up, confused. What do you mean? You could be with anyone. You're brilliant and successful and genuinely kind. You could have someone who's already established, who doesn't come with baggage. Who? Elena. Joon Ha set down his food and moved closer. You're not baggage. You're not a project. You're just you. And that's all I've ever wanted. But why? Joon Ha thought for a moment, his expression serious. Because the first time I saw you, he said, you were teaching a kid who everyone else had written off. And you didn't treat him like he was broken or difficult or less than. You treated him like he mattered. Like his potential was already there, just waiting for someone to see it. Elena's throat tightened. And I thought, Joon Ha continued, if that's how she treats a kid she barely knows, imagine how she'd treat someone she actually cared about. Elena's eyes stung. Joon Ha. You asked why you. Joon Ha said softly. That's why? Because you're the kind of person who makes people feel seen. And I wanted to be seen by you. Elena leaned forward and kissed him, slow, deliberate, full of everything she couldn't say out loud. When they pulled apart, Joon Ha smiled. So, about this nonprofit you're starting. Elena laughed, wiping her eyes. What about it? I want to help. Not as a donor. As a partner. Elena's heart did something complicated. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. But I want to. If you'll let me. Elena looked at him. This man who'd shown up without fanfare, who'd waited without pressure, who'd loved her without conditions. and she realized something that made her chest ache in the best way. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to say yes. Okay, Elena said. Let's build it together. Joon Ha grinned. Good, because I already have ideas. They stayed up until 2 a.m., sketching out plans on Elena's coffee table, laughing and arguing and dreaming about what they could create. And somewhere across the country, in a Chicago brownstone that used to feel like home, Marcus sat alone in the dark, scrolling through old photos of a woman he'd thrown away, wondering, too late, what his life might have been if he'd learned to see her when she was still there. 1 year later, Elena stood in the lobby of a converted warehouse in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood, watching contractors install the sign above the entrance. The Brooks Literacy Foundation. The name had been Joon Ha's idea. It's your vision, he'd said when Elena protested. It should be your name. The foundation wasn't big, not yet. Just 3 classrooms, 2 offices, and a community space where families could gather for workshops and tutoring sessions. But it was hers. Elena had written the grants herself, built the curriculum from scratch, hired 2 instructors she'd trained personally. Every decision, every detail, every inch of the space reflected the vision she'd been carrying since that night in the snow. A place where people weren't charity cases, where learning wasn't a privilege, where dignity was the baseline, not the goal. Joon Ha had funded part of it, yes. But Elena had raised 60% of the budget herself, through grants, through partnerships, through sheer determination to prove that she could build something that wasn't handed to her. And she had. Looks good, Joon Ha said, coming up beside her. Elena smiled. Yeah, it does. The foundation opened in March. Within 2 months, they had a waiting list. Elena taught 3 classes a week and spent the rest of her time managing logistics, meeting with donors, and building partnerships with schools and community organizations. It was exhausting, chaotic, overwhelming, and Elena had never been happier. One afternoon in late April, Lynn stopped by to visit. You did it, Lynn said, looking around the space with obvious pride. We did it, Elena corrected. Lynn smiled. You know, when you first showed up at Voices and Pages, I wasn't sure you'd stay. You seemed fragile, like you were one bad day away from disappearing. I probably was. But you didn't disappear. You rebuilt. And now look at you. Elena felt her throat tighten. Thank you for giving me a chance when I didn't think I deserved one. Lynn squeezed her shoulder. You always deserved it, Elena. You just needed to believe it yourself. That night, Elena and Joon Ha had dinner at a small restaurant in Ballard, celebrating the foundation's 3-month anniversary. Have you heard from him? Joon Ha asked carefully. Elena knew who he meant. No, not since that phone call. Joon Ha nodded. Good. I looked him up once, Elena admitted. A few months ago. Just curiosity. And he's not doing great. Lost his job at Sterling and Cross. Something about a professional conduct violation. There were rumors about the way he treated junior staff. Women, specifically. Joon Ha's expression hardened. Sounds like he finally faced consequences. Yeah. Elena took a sip of wine. I thought I'd feel, I don't know, vindicated, satisfied, but I just felt sad. Why? Because he could have been different. He chose to be the way he was. And now he's paying for it. Joon Ha reached across the table and took her hand. You're allowed to feel sad for him, but you don't have to carry his choices anymore. Elena nodded. I know. They finished dinner and walked home along the waterfront, the Seattle skyline glittering against the dark water. Can I tell you something? Elena said. Always. I used to think I needed to forgive him. Marcus. Like that was the final step in healing. Letting go of the anger, making peace with what he did. And now I think forgiveness is optional. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter. But I don't owe him absolution. I just owe myself peace. Joon Ha stopped walking and turned to face her. You're incredible. You know that. Elena laughed softly. I'm really not. You are. Joon Ha cupped her face gently. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into something meaningful. You didn't let it break you. You let it build you. Elena's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't have done it without you. Yes, you could have, Joon Ha said firmly. You were already doing it when I met you. I just got to watch. Elena kissed him, slow and deep, and thought about how strange it was that the worst night of her life had led her here. To this city, this work, this man, to herself. 6 months later, the Brooks Literacy Foundation received its first major national grant, $500,000 to expand programming, and open a second location in Tacoma. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning. Elena was teaching when Lynn burst into the classroom, waving a printed email. "We got it," Lynn shouted. Elena's students looked up, confused. Elena read the email, her hands shaking, and felt something break open in her chest. "We got it," she whispered. That night, Elena and Joon Ha celebrated at home. Takeout tie on the floor, just like old times. "You're going to need a bigger team," Joon Ha said. "More instructors. An operations manager." "I know." Elena smiled. "It's terrifying. But good terrifying." "Yeah, good terrifying." Joon Ha pulled her close, and they sat there in comfortable silence, the city lights flickering through the window. "I'm proud of you," Joon Ha said quietly. "I'm proud of me too," Elena replied. And she meant it. Elena Brooks had been thrown away like trash, told she was worthless, told she'd never be wanted. But she'd built a life that didn't need Marcus's approval, a life that didn't need revenge or validation or closure. She'd built a life that was simply, powerfully hers. And that, Elena realized, was the best ending she could have asked for. Not because she'd won, but because she'd learned that winning was never the point. The point was becoming someone who no longer needed to fight. Someone who could look in the mirror and see, finally, someone worth believing in. The end.